So welcome to this Religion Media Centre Zoom briefing, which is on the subject of religion and the war in Ukraine. And we're very pleased to welcome guests from the UK and also from the United States. And we have journalists on the call, and we have a special guest to be interviewed, Lord Rowan Williams, who will come to you later, interviewed by Paul Vallely. But we're going to start the Zoom with a panel discussion, and it's a large panel, and we're trying to catch the different views that have been expressed in the various articles and interviews that have already taken place in this first week of the war in Ukraine. I'll introduce you all one by one, otherwise it'll take forever to read your names out. So Professor Aristotle Papanikolaou from New York, from Fordham University. Perhaps I can come to you first. You have the chair in Orthodox theology there. And I wonder if you could just give us the background to this. There's a lot of column inches to explain what the religious dimension to this war is, and the claim of the Russian Orthodox Church on Kiev and what happened in Kiev in 988 AD. Can I just ask you briefly to explain the origin of the Russian Orthodox Church and the importance of Kiev in its life?
Yes, I mean, thank you for having me. And I also want to mention our Orthodox Christian Studies Center and our e-publication Public Orthodoxy to those who are attending, who could be a good source of information for many of these questions as well. The general schematic is that the Rus people were converted in the 10th century. They visited Constantinople. They saw the liturgy of Saint Sophia and the famous statement that they knew not whether they were on heaven or on earth. And but that conversion, that central kind of conversion, occurred around, not in Moscow, but around the area of Kiev. And then of course it expanded, and of course you have now I'm giving a very general schematic. Then you have sort of the emergence of the Russian Empire, and so you had what was considered to some extent to be what we now call Russian Orthodoxy, really somewhat expanded. The imagination somehow expanded into the Russian Empire, which of course had many territories as well. But there was always a particular kind of relationship there. There was a particular jurisdiction or bishop, or what we call metropolia in Kiev. Around 1689, it came under the Moscow Patriarchate. That was kind of a tense, somewhat of a tense relationship. And then there's all kinds of questions about Ukrainian identity, its people, and an independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which there was a movement in the 1920s towards that, together with a movement towards Ukrainian nationhood. And of course, obviously the communists sort of put that to rest, but all that reemerged again in the 1990s, right? Without gaining very much momentum. And then within the past year, the Ecumenical Patriarch did grant what's called a tomos to grant autocephaly or independence to Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That's really kind of a small piece, I think, in the puzzle, because some might, I doubt it very much if somehow Vladimir Putin's reasons for invading Ukraine had very much to do with that, right? But it is a small piece that's somewhat symbolic of a certain kind of independence of the Ukrainian people from Russia, from Russian identity. Sure. And this conflicts in some ways with this broader thing about Russian world that is also playing into it.
Thank you very much. So we do have people here from the two branches of the Orthodox Church that we were talking about there. Can I bring in Father Stephen Platt at this point? Father Stephen, you're the Secretary for Inter-Christian Affairs for the Russian Orthodox Church in Great Britain and Ireland. I just wonder, in the diaspora, in the Russian Orthodox Church in the diaspora, how important is that legend, that story of the baptism in Rus in 988? How important is that in your identity, in your life?
It is a seminal point in the popular consciousness of the and self-identification of Russian Orthodox people and their church. And in fact, as Professor Papanicolaou has pointed out, the crucible, the font out of which what would subsequently see itself as Russia was baptized was Kiev, and the source of what might be called Russian Orthodox Christianity stems ultimately from Constantinople via Kiev, but has expanded and has moved in particular directions which were interpreted by different groups within the Orthodox communities in that part of the world very differently now.
When you look at the arguments that are made for the invasion of Ukraine, that it has something to do with the purity of the origin of the Russian Orthodox Church, can you see that logic? Do you agree with that logic?
No, I don't agree with that logic, and I don't see. Well, first of all, the notion of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and so on, this is not an entirely new invention. This is something which is a restatement of political theories which were popular in the 19th century. And in spiritual terms, it is clear that there is a connection between all of the Christian communities of that part of the Slavic world. But how that connection is interpreted varies very differently between those different faith communities.
I'm sure there'll be questions coming back to you later. If you just stay with us, Stephen, during this, thank you. We haven't got our representative from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that's split off. They have a representative in London. We haven't got them yet. We do have from the Catholic Church, Bishop Kenneth Novakovsky. And Bishop, you are from the Ukrainian Catholic Church in London. I want to ask you some questions about your contact with the people in Ukraine and the relationship that your congregation has with the people in Ukraine. What are they saying to you about their faith, the way that they're approaching this, the way that they look at the Orthodox Church and the relationships between the churches in the Ukraine? What are the stories that you're hearing?
Well, thank you very much for having me on this Zoom meeting, this panel. First of all, I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is truly unthinkable. The churches, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in fact, I'm sure all of the churches and religious denominations and are doing what they've been always called to do, and that's provide pastoral ministry and guidance to their faithful, and especially for Christians in the light of the gospel. Our relationship with our brothers and sisters in Ukraine is very strong. Many of our parishioners, our faithful, are recent arrivals in the last 20 years here in the UK, and so they have very strong connections. They are in constant communication by all of the social media possible and are horrified what's going on. The churches, wherever possible and whenever possible, are open for people to come in and pray, to receive blessings. And here in the UK, our churches also are open and allowing people to come in and pray. We knew that on Sunday, our Patriarch, His Beatitude Sviatoslav, issued a statement, unfortunately telling people to stay at home because of martial law. And we felt it very important to show our solidarity in our churches here in the UK, to be in church, to be with our people who are praying in underground shelters.
And what are you hearing about the role of the church, apart from being open for prayer, in terms of its work for refugees, for feeding people? We hear that food is running out, pharmacies are shut. What is the practical kind of work that's going on that's possible?
Well, the practical work that's going on has to do with the Roman Catholic and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church's official charity agency, Caritas Ukraine and Caritas Spes, and they are working very hard, as in all of the regions that it's possible for them to work at, to provide humanitarian aid, first need requirements, hygiene packages, and definitely very much, especially in Western Ukraine, coordinating with Caritas Poland in providing first essential things for those who are on the border waiting to leave Ukraine and enter into Poland, and then certainly the Caritas workers in Poland.
And are people turning up at your church in London to give supplies? Or, I mean, are there kind of expressions of hope and interest that are just flooding in? What's going on?
Well, we have several locations that humanitarian aid has been is being brought. That includes both the Polish club that really has been very supportive in all of this and organizing that, and also at our various centers in London at Holland Park, our Ukrainian club, and the various Ukrainian communities here, including the Orthodox Church, the Autocephalous Orthodox Church, and our church, and other community organizations have set up a GoFundMe page. And yesterday, when I last looked, I think it was just over £1 million that were raised in the last week. And that money will be going to a few organizations, including the Ukrainian Red Cross and Caritas Ukraine, and a medical agency.
Thank you. And again, there will be questions that we can come back to you on a bit later. So lastly, in this panel section, before I hand over to Paul Vallely for the big interview, Katie Kalidis, a writer and historian on contemporary Orthodox identity, amongst other subjects. Katie, you wrote in Religion Dispatches that you believed that this was a religious war. Religion was at the heart of this war. Can you just explain your thinking to us around that?
I mean, to be clear, I don't think, once again, Vladimir Putin is sitting in his I assume what I assume is a bunker, sort of thinking about this solely in religious terms. Obviously concerned about NATO and the EU, the Russian border. But I also think that sort of part of this story is the conflict within Orthodox Christianity, within the Orthodox Christian cultural sphere, about how Orthodoxy will confront 21st century Western modernity, and how that plays out in a cultural community, in a historical cultural community that has oftentimes created itself in opposition to that Western modernity. And so I think that's part of what's going on here. It's certainly, I believe, part of the debate that was raging, has been going on for the past, at least 4 years, about the independence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Thank you. And do stay on the call, because I'm sure there'll be questions in the discussion with everybody afterwards. But I'm pleased to hand over to Paul Vallely now for our interview with Lord Rowan Williams.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and welcome, Archbishop Williams. Thank you very much for taking part in this. I want to begin by picking up some of the thoughts that have been advanced by the previous speakers. I was struck by how Vladimir Putin was mocked as unhinged and mad, which he may well be, but the evidence on which this was based by Western commentators was his references to what we've been just hearing about, the idea of Holy Russia. I mean, in that long speech last week, he talked about Ukraine being an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. And this isn't something that he's just invented. He's been talking about this for many years, if not decades. And last year, he he penned something on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians and said that Ukraine was being turned from being not Russia into being anti-Russia by the Western powers. And just one final thing, and this is a long question. If we go back to the baptism of Vladimir the Great, which is in Crimea, when Putin annexed Crimea, he took a stone from the place of baptism, of Vladimir's baptism, and had it built into the giant statue of Vladimir outside the Kremlin gates. So there is a something here which perhaps is not as recent as commentators are suggesting. But what I'd like to get an impression from you is partly what we've heard from previous speakers. Is this all a kind of bit of cultural spin doctrine to cover up his political and geopolitical ambitions? Or is there something about the idea of Holy Russia which we in the West don't really understand and need to understand?
I think the idea that that you mentioned of the Holy Russia tradition is something that Westerners do find it quite hard to get their minds around. And it's not simply a picture of Russia as a sort of messianic state. It's also, curiously, a mixed picture of Russia as a kind of suffering servant, the Russian people who have always been marginalized, invaded, defeated, oppressed. It may not look like that to us, but that is how the story is told within Russia. The Mongol domination of the Middle Ages, the Polish invasions of the 16th, 17th century, Napoleon's invasion, and of course, the Great Patriotic War against Hitler and the Nazis. All of that flows into a narrative of Russia being a victim, a sort of colossal Christian victim of forces outside itself, which may be Western Catholic, which may be secular, which may be whatever. And to understand some of the emotions that are swirling around in the Kremlin, I think we have to understand that narrative, which keeps surfacing. So you're quite right. It's not something that Putin has invented opportunistically. It's something which he is keying into. And that, as I say, is one of the paradoxes. Here we see Russia, and always have seen Russia, as an immense threatening presence, very much so in the Cold War era, but even before that, if you look at the 19th century and tropes and stereotypes about Russia in British thought at that time. But Russia often sees itself as I say, a victim, and a victim because it is faithful, because it is a witness to Orthodox Christianity, a sort of Christ-like people. And that, as you say, that is something which goes deep in the imagination in the 19th century. We may find it bizarre, and looking at the situation at the moment, faced with a naked act of aggression and unrestrained, indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, anything less Christ-like is hard to imagine. And yet that narrative is there, and it's important somehow to get our imaginations a little bit around it. Just one other thing to mention in this connection is something which has surfaced just a little bit here and there, curiously in some bits of the transatlantic commentariat on the far right. The fact of the Ukrainian president's Jewish background is not wholly insignificant. I think it's very important that he commented about the missile strike at the Holocaust Memorial of Babi Yar. But I think there are one or two people who say, well, you know, he is somebody who represents that cosmopolitan, anti-Christian, secularizing force, which is the West over against the Orthodox Christian world. Now, that's not a very widespread trope, but it is there. I've seen quotes about that in the last couple of days, and I think we probably better keep our eyes open and our ears open for that as well.
Is it something that we need to address in some way when we're talking to and about President Putin, or is it something that we can afford to disregard? I mean, you made a really fascinating program recently on Radio 4 called Dostoevsky and the Russian Soul, and in it you asked the question: does Russia have a unique vocation within the human family? And I want to just go back to my first question, which is there something here which we need to, which is offered to us rather than, you know, being put upon us? Is there something that we need to, I mean, what is the answer to that question? Does the Russian Christian vision have something to offer which is unique to the human family, human Christian family, or the wider family?
It's a good question. And I think, again, going back to the great 19th century writers and the kind of primal soup of ideas about all this, which you find in so many of the thinkers of that age and the artists of that age, there's certainly a sense that, yes, Russia has a vocation in the worldwide human family, not just the Christian family. And the most interesting and sensitive writers say, well, and that vocation has something to do actually with the critique of absolutism, the critique of power and domination. It's something to do with the value and preciousness of the poor and the forgotten. It's all to do also with that powerful Russian sense, which you find both historically and in folklore, of the fool for Christ, the utterly vulnerable, utterly defenseless person who stands up to naked power, the holy fool in the city of Pskov in the 16th century who confronted Ivan the Terrible when he was on his way to destroy the city. You know, that is part of the tradition as much as the triumphalism we're looking at. And I suppose that I know that what many Russians, many Russian Orthodox I know feel so torn about at the moment is this extraordinarily rich and sophisticated tradition of understanding vulnerability and marginality as the place where God is to be found, feeding that into a narrative essentially of the revenge of the repressed, the revenge of the marginal, not a matter of witness, but a matter of, if you like, avenging centuries of victimhood. And that does seem to me pretty toxic.
You're addressing this in a way which is, you know, highlighting the positivity, which is what I would expect from you. But if we go back to the more apocalyptic way that Katie put it, this idea that there is a dichotomy between the East and the West. The East and the West are enemies. I mean, that was part of your Dostoevsky program. And you had an interesting thought that the West and Russia needed the idea of each other to make sense of themselves. It's about our own self-identity. But if you look, I mean, in his speech in 2013, which is, you know, nearly a decade ago, Putin says this, I'll read you the quote: "We see many of the Euro-Atlantic countries are actually rejecting their roots, including the Christian values that constitute the basis of Western civilization." I think this is what Katie was talking about. They are denying moral principles and all traditional identities, national, cultural, religious, even sexual. They are implementing policies that equate large families with same-sex partnership, belief in God with belief in Satan. I mean, this is pretty dark stuff. Does this go beyond the kind of the dark obsession of Vladimir Putin, and is it something within the wider picture that we need to contend with? I mean, if Putin goes, will he be replaced by somebody with a similar vision?
Yes, I think that is one of the risks that we face. And that's part of what I meant by referring to the triumphalist tone, the mixture of being very threatened and being very aggressive, which we find in that kind of apocalyptic language about the decline of the West and the triumph of different values, and not least, of course, the near obsession with sexual ethics and gender identity as somehow a sign of apocalyptic decline, which feeds very well into certain other kinds of ultra-conservative Christian narratives in parts of the West and parts of the United States. So I don't think that it's a case of one particular political strongman enforcing an ideology which people would be very glad to be rid of. I think it is something which is very deep-rooted in parts of Russian culture, and which elements in the Russian church, which have on the whole not been in the driving seat in the last half century quite so much, elements in the Russian church are very glad to revive and and pursue and exaggerate that sense that here you have a society which is standing against the corruption and destruction of all God-given values. Here you have a society which stands for that and which therefore is despised and marginalized by the rest of the world and threatened by any sign of strength on its borders. And Ukraine is, you might say, exactly in the firing line. It's in the crosshairs because of all that. And it's in the crosshairs partly because here is, as we've heard, not only a traditionally Orthodox country, but the country from which the great stream of Russian Christianity first originated before there were national borders, as we understand them. So Ukraine, to a certain kind of Russian, Ukraine is particularly problematic because it looks like us, but it isn't.
And that's
like
been one of the other great traditions, looking at it from the outside of Russian history, the idea of looking to the West and looking to the East. If you go back to Peter the Great, you know, Putin's great hero, we see both reform and tyranny. We see both looking both ways. And does Ukraine somehow offer an unpleasant reminder of that to Vladimir Putin, a place that looks in two directions at once?
The clue is in the name, as they say. Ukraine means a border area. It's like the Marches in England and Wales. It means that area of overlap. And so, yes, it looks like us, but also for a lot of its history, it's been part of non-Russian states. And it has a substantial tradition of involvement with other states, other cultures. So it's not the uniform Muscovite Russian identity that we're talking about. And yet there is that shared history, that massively important shared history, and there is that common ground of orthodoxy. But it's very interesting, I think very significant, that the leader of the Moscow allied Orthodox group in Ukraine, Metropolitan Onufry, has been very, very forthright in his condemnation of the actions by Putin and the Russian state. And others have said, well, if the Patriarch of Moscow claims to be the chief pastor of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, how is it that he has so little to say about his own flock killing one another?
I think other people, I'm expecting other people to ask questions about the split within Orthodoxy, but I just wanted to finish by asking a very brief question. Your doctoral thesis was on Vladimir Lossy, the Orthodox theologian, whose most famous book is The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. And I just thought it would be helpful to ask you, is there something about the Eastern Church which is more mystical and has a greater dependence upon a mystical tradition than the West? And do Western Christians have some difficulty in identifying with that?
There's a very, very powerful strand of disciplined and deep contemplative practice in the Eastern Christian world, from which I think Western Christians need to learn and can learn. And I would gratefully say I have learned over the years. Interesting once again that some of the most significant of the classical texts, the text known as the Philokalia, the great anthology of spiritual writing from the 18th century, the original collection was made in Greece, but then translations into Slavonic and then into Russian were actually made in these border areas, not in Great Russia, in Muscovite Russia, but precisely in this melting pot of Ukraine and Moldova, bits of Romania. So even that most central gift to the Christian world, represented by this great spiritual anthology, is not simply a creation of Great Russian identity. It's precisely the commonwealth of Orthodox ideas and vision, which is shared across the borders of Russia. And when that tradition is identified simply with the dominance of what we call Great Russia and the Muscovite political idea, something, well, not only something is lost, but something becomes, as I've said, very, very toxic for the whole region.
When you were a young man, you nearly converted. Well, that's not probably not the right word, converted, but you became a member of the Orthodox Church. What actually stopped you?
Partly the sense that I wanted to discover and exercise my Christian faith in my own cultural context. And while I admired, loved, learned from the Orthodox world, I was a bit cautious about the temptation, if you like, to try and jump out of my skin into something else. Others have managed that with remarkable success. I don't think I could have.
Thank you very much, Rowan. Over to you now, Ruth, for the wider questioning.
Thank you. So now we're opening it up to other journalists on the call who can ask questions of you, Dr. Williams, or any of the panelists who are still with us. Can I go to you, Christopher, first of all, Christopher Lamb?
Thank you, Ruth. To Rowan Williams, my question is really about how this alliance between President Putin and the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, it's not the whole Russian Orthodox Church, but the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, how they've become kind of offered leadership to conservative Christians on the right across the world, and how, in a sense, they've pushed this alliance between religion and politics, sometimes populist right-wing politics, and how much of an influence that's had in places like the US with Trump, etc. Because there have been those who've argued, and I wrote a piece for the Religion Media Center, who say that Trump really took Putin's script when it came to aligning with the religious right in the US. So how influential do you think this has been, this alliance between the Russian leadership, the Orthodox Church, and Putin in spreading ideas of alliances across the world and in Europe?
Interesting question, but I think I would resist too much assimilation of these phenomena. There are echoes and there are bits of the American religious right which are quite happy to, if you like, to cut Putin quite a bit of slack because of this background. But what's different, to my mind, is in Russia you have a long history of a single, highly sophisticated, widespread Christian community, tied up for centuries with the sense of national identity. Now that will express itself certainly in terms of an adoption of traditional religious and moral values, will reflect itself these days in concerns about the dissolution and reformation of values around sexuality and so forth, but its roots are somewhere else. I think in the United States, you're dealing with a much more ad hoc set of culture war issues. You don't have that deep, centuries-long association between national identity and one religious body. So when Russian or sometimes Georgian Orthodox leaders will say strong things about the decline of the West and the decline of the family in the West, there will be American conservative Christians who will be delighted to hear it, but it's coming from a very different place. And I think what you might call the institutional, theological, sacramental hinterland is rather different. So influential within the Russian world, welcome to some outsider, but I wouldn't say influential in exactly the same way.
Thank you. I wonder, could I ask Father Stephen Platt, also on the call, how you see that in the diaspora, the relationship between the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church and Putin and the connection with the far right?
I think that Archbishop Rowan has spoken very well. I'm grateful to him because it is possible for him, from his perspective, he knows us very well. He, in many ways, has been integrally related with our life, especially through his time, both as an active academic and as a bishop of the Church of England, in a way which has been perceptive but charitable. The Russian Orthodox Church, please understand, is a very large church, and it is diverse. And the Russian Orthodox Church suffers in a way from the name, because Ruska Tserkev is not the same or coterminous with the contemporary Russian state. It is something quite different from that. But here we also have difficulties in terms of how that Rus is interpreted. We Russian Orthodox in the West are well acquainted to having existed through periods where our bishops within Russia spoke with a voice which we had to understand in a nuanced way. And it's interesting that Vladimir Losky, who was mentioned, the subject of Archbishop Rowan's research, was himself such a Russian Orthodox Christian living in the West, who felt a calling to remain within the context of the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, because it would be very easy for us to step outside and to criticize from the borders. It is more difficult for those of us living in the West and whose own personal and cultural and national upbringing has nothing at all to do with Russia. It's much more difficult for us to remain within this structure for good, and to try to find out of that path something which is good. If, for example, one sees the situation now with regards to the horrors that are occurring in Ukraine, we see that the Russian Orthodox Church speaks with different voices. The words which are coming from Metropolitan Onufri, for the in case there is anybody who is not clear about the ecclesiastical distinctions of the different groups in Ukraine, because the situation is complex, Metropolitan Onufri is the primate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which ultimately owes its allegiance to the Patriarchate of Moscow. It is the largest Orthodox group in the country, but also itself, because of this connection with the Moscow Patriarchate, is frequently regarded as having itself confused motives. And in fact, even within this church, there will be different opinions expressed. But the voice which is coming from Metropolitan Onufri in Kiev is different from that which is coming from within Moscow.
I've got a question in the chat box. Sorry to interrupt there, but the question is, do we need ecclesiastical diplomacy alongside the political kind? Are there any ways in which churches can enact sanctions or at least distance themselves from churches which support aggressive nationalism? What can you do, Father Stephen? Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Orthodox Church as a whole, from the very outset, from the Byzantine Empire at least, has had a very difficult relationship with what we would now consider to be nationalism or ethnic identity. It is, I would say, and this is something that Rowan alluded to in the context of the development of Christianity in Russia, in the Russian Orthodox world, but the Orthodox self-identity as being us in opposed to them, a sort of innate persecution complex, well, what one might call persecution superiority complex, is not something which the Russian Orthodox world has a monopoly on within the Orthodox family of Christians. We find the same thing elsewhere. Speaking on a personal level, I have grave reservations about what one might term ecclesiastical diplomacy. And when churches begin to use their bishops, their hierarchs, their primates, and so on as a diplomatic staff, we go completely in the wrong direction, because an Orthodox understanding of church hierarchy is Eucharistically focused. The focus should not be on diplomacy or establishing borders between people. The Christian church is a community without borders.
Well, this is a good point, perhaps to bring in the bishop on the call, Bishop Kenneth Novakovsky. So should you be saying anything political? Should you be doing what the previous questioner was asking, creating your own sanctions, creating your own diplomatic initiatives?
I think that the time is not for sanctions against one church after the other. I agree with everything that Father Stephen Platt has said. I think that our role is to heal the wounds of a separated church, of a separated Christ, and not to impose sanctions on each other. And I think that we have already developed platforms where we can talk to each other. Certainly in Ukraine, the All Council of Churches has been a very, very excellent platform for religious leaders to come together to discuss the needs and their concerns. And I would not want to see churches beginning to wage sanctions, whatever that could be, on each other.
Thank you. Can I go to Rosie Dawson now, who I think has a question?
Just a very straight question to Lord Williams and to Father Stephen. If I were to put you in a sealed room for 2 minutes with the Patriarch Kirill, I just wonder what you would want him to hear.
I would want to say, it is your people who are being killed. It's not foreigners, it's not strangers, it is your people. How do you make sense of that? What are you going to do about it?
And what would you want him to do?
I would want him to make a statement pressing for a ceasefire immediately.
Father Stephen?
I would be of the same mind as Archbishop Rowan. And in fact, I would point out that there is currently a letter which has been signed by a number of clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church appealing along these lines.
Thank you. I'm sure others have questions, Ruth.
Well, perhaps the professor would like to come in at this point. I've just seen you on mute. As to, I wonder whether this is a crisis of leadership within the Russian Orthodox Church, or should it be?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the Russian Orthodox Church over the past 3 decades, I mean, one of the things that should really should not go unnoticed is that when communism fell, it was not necessarily the case that Russian identity would be linked with Orthodox identity, as much as there was a history of that. It was not necessarily the case that that was going to happen. And the Russian Orthodox Church fought very hard to reestablish that link. And still, even into 2000s, right around Putin, it wasn't necessarily the case that that was still going to happen. But somehow they did it. It was kind of it's to some extent a remarkable, I don't know whether you want to call it, what you want to call it now, but it's a remarkable occurrence. It's a remarkable point of fact of history. And it really is around 2012 that Putin started to take up this religious history in his rhetoric, right? So he somewhat solidified it. He somewhat kind of gave it, and it really has led to statistics that show by Pew Research Center and other places that 90% of, or maybe that's a little too high, but about 70 to 80%, it's a very high figure, of Russians identify as Orthodox, right? Now, they may not go, and there's all kinds of things about it, but that's the same in Greece too. 90% of the Greeks identify as Orthodox, but they don't all go. So that whole thing about whether they go or not really is to some extent irrelevant, because they identify. So that link somehow has been reestablished. Now, but to some extent, they have pushed themselves into a corner. And because now they were able to internally to establish this identity and then become a very powerful institutional force, right? They now are in a corner because now they are pretty much, I don't know, this may be a little bit excessive. People may accuse me of this of being excessive, but to some extent they've become a Department of State. And as an institution, not all parishes, not all Russian Orthodox Christians, but the Moscow Patriarchate to some extent has been working hand in hand with the foreign ministry. And Putin now has taken up this narrative, and that narrative has become a very important part of, it's not the only reason, but it's become a very important part of how Putin has seen Ukraine, how the reason for the invasion. So there absolutely is a crisis, and whether the other autocephalous churches, the leaders of the autocephalous churches, how direct they will be in terms of calling Kirill to ultimately issue a statement for his people. I mean, that's been uneven. that's been incredibly uneven. In fact, we have a wonderful piece in Public Orthodoxy, sorry for the self-promotion, by Deacon John Chrysavies, who really, to some extent, calls out that unevenness. I'd like to make one last point, coming back to the issue of the transnational. Religion really plays two roles here. One is in this kind of Russian identity in relationship to Ukraine, this idea of the Russian world, that somehow the Russian people are broader than borders, and somehow Ukraine and Ukrainian people are really part of the Russian sphere, this Russian world, and that kind of narrative. So that's one way, and I think, but that is absolutely crisscrossing with this narrative of traditional, as Ron pointed out, traditional values, the godlessness of the West, the godlessness of the LGBTQ movement and morality in the West, and so on and so forth. So whatever Russian world is, it's an alternative civilization to what they're seeing, right? And that absolutely has transnational connections to it. There's absolutely no question about that. There is, I do agree that it comes from a different place, but not necessarily, because there are many Christian nationalists here in the United States who are using the narrative of America being a Christian nation, right? Having this heritage, having this sort of, so it's coming a little bit from a same place. This reestablishment of a certain kind of manifest Christian identity, Christian culture. And there are many, it's not simply that there are conservatives here in the United States. I mean, there are people on the alt-right and that are literally seeing Putin as some kind of savior and kind of publicly proclaiming that. So I wouldn't minimize that crisscrossing of religion in terms of both the traditional values debate happening in the West and appealing to populist movements, and this broader Russian world that's really kind of internal to the Russian sphere.
There's another question in the chat box. I don't know if this is you again, Professor, or one of the other panelists on the call. Will Russia's invasion lead to a major redrawing of the Orthodox map? In particular, can we expect the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate to break with Moscow? And will it deepen the international isolation of the Russian Orthodox Church? Who would like to take that?
Well, let me say a quick thing on that. That's people are talking about that, and I'll put in the chat an article by someone who has been commenting on these, and so there is speculation about that. Whether that will happen or not, honestly, will depend on how the war unfolds. I think I really think it'll depend on how the war unfolds. But I will put a link in the chat that just to indicate that there's already discussion about this from some very thoughtful people. So.
Can I come to you, Katie Kalidis, from your observations earlier on the call? You're talking about modern orthodoxy. You write about modern orthodoxy. I'm just wondering how, what tectonic plates are shifting because of the war in Ukraine? What new alliances are being made, even cross denominations and within orthodoxy, that may develop from some kind of peace initiative?
So I think that these sort of moving tectonic plates and these shifting alliances were present before the invasion. I think the invasion has highlighted a lot of these changing realities. I think one of the, going back to the link between Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, and the American far right, one of the things that I think we don't talk about enough really is that in the post-Soviet era, the American evangelicals provided money and catechism materials and Bibles to the Russian Orthodox Church. They provided this real material support. So I think the cross-pollination is more than just, we like what you say about marriage equality, for example. So I think those alliances, there's a real danger that those alliances could be strengthened. At the same time, I wonder if an invasion of the Ukraine could push American evangelicals too far in terms of their alliance with Russia. I also think part of what is going on is that, and I hate to use conservative and progressive sort of generally that way, but I think more progressive Orthodox Christians, more Western-facing Orthodox Christians, people concerned with things like orthodoxy and human rights and orthodoxy and liberal democracy, might be increasingly pushed into these alliances with other, mainline Protestants, progressive Catholics. And that is, I think, really going to be interesting to watch, because those kind of alliances have been demonized in many parts of the Orthodox world. And I'm interested to see how that plays out as a matter of identity, and the ways in which political identity is merging with, and in some cases transplanting, religious identity all over Western Europe and North America.
Thank you. Could I just return to you, Bishop, now again, and ask you what is going on in the UK in terms of the conversations that you're having with other denominations, or with your various international headquarters of the various large number of denominational groupings that there are in Ukraine. What is going on internationally amongst church groups to address calls for peace, calls to stop the war?
Thank you. I think one of the big things that we can be doing is, first of all, supporting our faithful on the ground and help them, again, in pastoral ways, but we can also assist by speaking to church leaders in the countries that we're in. We can be the voice, the messengers in many ways of what is going on in Ukraine to our civil leaders, not talking to them in political manners, but talking to them about the humanitarian crisis that's occurring in Ukraine, and certainly will be occurring and is occurring in the European countries that border Ukraine. I think those are the things that our religious communities, our religious leaders outside of Ukraine can be doing, and in fact are doing. We certainly have been doing that here in the UK. We've met with the Prime Minister, with the leader of the opposition and other influencers, I think by talking to the media and making sure that we are challenging the weaponization of information, and we can be talking about what the truth is. We can make sure that we are not talking polemic against each other. I think those are the things that our leaders are doing, our faith leaders are doing, and we will continue to do that.
Thank you. I wonder if I could go to you, Lord Williams, for the final words in this. If Orthodox Church members around the world sour in their support for the Moscow Patriarchate because of links to Putin, will it tilt power towards Constantinople and the ecumenical patriarch?
I doubt very much whether it'll be as simple as that, to be honest. It's not as if there are just two centers of power in the Orthodox world. It's a very diffuse picture. But I must say, I would hope and pray that, as has been hinted, there would be some possibility of a number of senior Orthodox leaders outside Russia standing together on this, and possibly standing together with leaders of other churches. If, for symbolic purposes, the Pope and some of the other patriarchs, the Archbishop of Canterbury, together could say something clear about the need for an immediate ceasefire, for the need for reopening diplomatic engagement, that might at least send a signal, because I absolutely agree with Bishop Kenneth that what most matters is support on the ground and making sure that we express solidarity with those most at risk. But there are perhaps some things at a higher level that could also be said, and I'm praying there may be some way of saying that effectively.